Good day, everyone. I don't need to say good evening today because it's clearly a different webinar time to what we're used to. What is it? It's September. Summer's almost done. Happy September, everyone. This is our first, I guess you can call it fall webinar. We've shifted gears from the quote unquote fitness factors and we're getting back into the meat and potatoes or the microbes and mucosa, as I think I coined it in the article for the month, of what this company does really well. And I think what everyone who has a bias and an affinity for the Master Supplements US Enzymes product line really wants to dig into, and that's gut health. So this is the first in a series of three, what I'm calling Decoding Gut Dysfunction. And it's the little story that I've been trying to tell over the last 2 years in a variety of different ways, talking about working backwards from dealing with what your clients are suffering or afflicted with, and the potential genesis of the digestive system and its role in that process or in the development of that process, because the human body is a very interconnected thing. And on that note, I kind of want to introduce something because, the more I do these talks and the more I talk to people, I realize that people really remember stories. So I want to do a little bit of a story time to start this one, because it sets the tone for not only today, but it connects the dots for October and November. So it starts not in the gut, but preceding the gut. Each of us really is an absolute marvel of engineering. We have our aggregation of cells that we call an organism. Each of them have their own sense of identity. So each cell is its own little conscious being. They have methods of communication with each other, with us as an organism, and they have this drive for life and this program of health that's really all a cell knows. When you think about the concept of a program for health, and you then take stock of thinking about how many people on the planet that you know or that you see are unwell, that we've really got off the rails. So the body likes to work in this concept of syntropy. To me, syntropy is organization, is another way of looking at it. So in an ideal state, our body operates in this organization where things come and go, little stresses come up and they arise and they go away, and our body has enough health to organize healing strategies and we get back to a baseline of health. And in this context, this self-organizing nature of the body is really the ideal state of what it needs to be or what it knows. And the program of health, the ultimate health and the ability to maintain our health as a being, as an individual, is really in the concept of sustained and interconnected function within the body. So fundamentally, when something comes up, we have the energy to heal. If you remember, I've talked about from the beginning, energy is everything. And when we as an organism experience a series of compromises, i.e. imbalances, compensations, symptoms, and ultimately disease states, these are various aspects of our body losing this sustained and interconnected function. And in the result, or the process of that, the result is that we lose the energy in order to heal. So if you think about it, we are this marvel of engineering because in a course of 9 weeks, we are a fully formed fetal being in the womb as we're growing. So we go from what looks like a ball of tadpole eggs to technically a fully formed being inside of 9 weeks. But there's a really important point that happens within week 3 to 8, week 4 approximately. You can see there, even though we still kind of look a little bit like an amphibian, we have the beginnings of the development of the differentiation of specific cells and organs. So something called the forebrain, the midbrain, and the hindbrain, i.e. the nervous system form. And that's not the interesting part. It's also the time when the gut actually starts to form and differentiate. So by week 4, the same pattern follows in the digestive system. We have essentially the specific divisions that will eventually grow and develop into a stomach, small intestine, the specific divisions of the small intestine, a liver, a gallbladder, and they're mirrored in the forebrain, the midbrain, and the hindbrain, with the foregut, the midgut, and the hindgut. So our system is designed for this process to be very efficient in terms of how our gut becomes an integrated part of our being. And in many ways, it is the ultimate pathway to inner health or inner dis-ease, because it's the last barrier between the outside and the inside of our body. So that's the first part of it. The second part is we're not just 70 trillion human cells. Approximately, according to the NIH, we have about 39 trillion bacterial cells, way more bacterial genes, but approximately 39 trillion different bacterial cells that we're quote unquote gifted based upon how we're born from mom and from the environment around us. It's a mixture of bacteria. There are supposed to be represented fungi and yeasts, protozoa, phages, different kinds of archaea. And it's the dynamic of interaction between us, the ecosystem, which is the organisms, sorry, us, the host, and the organisms that creates an ecosystem that should be one of symbiotic nature. So this is a deeper element of what also underpins the nature of health, because if we, the host, are not a hospitable environment, we attract the wrong kinds of microbes, which create a discourse with our ability to sustain health. If we, the host, damage our microbiome and create an environment that is inhospitable to healthy microbes, and thus we attract different kinds of overgrowths of bacteria, fungi, parasites, well, we lose this fragile balance, this axis, which seems to influence all other axes of the body, which interacts with arguably the single most important system of the body, and that's the immune system. And the reason I say it's the most important system is it's the only one in the body that heals you, but it's also the only one in the body that can hurt you. So if the gut microbiome and all of the different avenues to which it connects, the gut-brain axis, the gut-lung axis, the gut-skin axis, the endocrine system, the autonomic nervous system, if this core, the symbiosis gets broken down, then that chaos ensues. So we go from syntropy to a concept of entropy. And it really is incredibly multifactorial. How we're born is influenced by the health of mom, which is also influenced by the health of dad, our early childhood exposures and the various exposures of environment, medical interventions, food choices, interactions inside versus outside. They start to select for a very specific phenotype of what your microbiome develops to, and thus the ecosystem of the back and forth between us, the individual, and the critters that live inside of us, for lack of better description, starts to take shape and develop its own specific framework. And if we really want to be super diligent, and this is a little preview of where I'd like to go with things, within the course of a day, our microbiome, our immune systems, and our digestible organs all go through the relatively regulated cycles. So when there's an active phase, for example, and foods coming into the gut, well, that's going to be a big influence on not only the activity of the immune system to make sure we're not eating something dangerous to us, it's also going to flush the body with nutrition and influence the microbiome. After the fact, anything that maybe came in with that food is going to be increased as a likelihood for pathogen susceptibility, which is going to cause our immune system to have to become active again in preparation for a calm phase before the next nutrition cycle comes. So in the course of 24 to 48 hours, your microbiome, depending on what it is you do, can go through a massive shift in its own specific identity. In the same way, a thumbprint is actually not in the same way. A thumbprint is static, but in the context of the microbiome, it's like we have different fingerprints depending on the time of day or what we do. So if you think about this, every time you eat is an opportunity to either regulate and anchor a healthy microbiome or potentially cause disruption based upon food choices, or more importantly, what I want to talk about today, the concept of the inability to regulate and optimize digestion. So fundamentally, this is the story I want to tell. It starts with digestive dysfunction. It doesn't matter what you eat. If you don't digest what you eat, you're going to create downstream problems for yourself. And those problems typically come in the way of dysbiosis. And it's not that it's going to be one time. It's not that it's going to be in a week. But fundamentally, if you're making poor food choices over time and not properly digesting your food over time, the likelihood of the development of dysbiosis is much more ingrained. And ultimately, what that can lead to is the concept of barrier dysfunction. And in the context of barrier dysfunction, I don't just mean leaky gut. I mean the ability for things to breach the gut barrier, for the contents of what's supposed to be evacuated from the body to translocate into the bloodstream, the lymphatic system, and the resulting systemic immune response, which this story is getting a lot of traction in not only the pathogenesis of many chronic degenerative conditions, but if anyone here deals with a lot of autoimmunity, there's a pretty hard and defined story that outlines that most autoimmune conditions, to some degree, follow this path in their genesis. And the differentiation of what the condition becomes is the person's genetic susceptibility and potential weaknesses. So fundamentally, why I want to tell this story is we as clinicians or those who are helping people as health coaches, we don't get the person when they're healthy. We get the person when they're at their likely most chaotic, when they've either had enough of ignoring it or when they've been through enough people and no one's provided them a solution. We want to figure out how can we take these concepts and apply it to the body so we can take the body from a state of dis-ease ultimately back to health. So we see patients in some degree of chaos. And what I mean by chaos is anytime you lose the ability to sustain health, there's a degree of chaos or entropy in the body. And the best clinicians reverse engineer those problems back to their optimal state of order. And this dovetails nicely into what I think is the lowest hanging fruit that I really want to dig into today. And that's the underappreciated role of digestion. So in a nutshell, we all know practically what digestion is, but it's really important not to forget the specific details because the devil is in the detail of the nuances when it comes to digestion. The food we eat is in its most complex form. The macronutrients are what it is we need to break down, and the micronutrients only get absorbed when we properly break down the macronutrients. So we're talking proteins, carbohydrates, and fats. And ultimately, we're taking these large molecules and we're breaking them into smaller molecules via two processes. One mechanical, we call that chewing, which no one seems to do anymore. And the other is chemical, and that's where knowing the process of digestion is very, very important. The reason we want to break these from large to small is the body ultimately knows only the smallest ideal molecule in terms of safe absorption. So what I mean by that is a protein is supposed to be absorbed as an amino acid. A complex carbohydrate is technically supposed to be absorbed as a sugar molecule, and a triglyceride gets broken down into a fatty acid and reassembled back into a triglyceride. And all of these nutrients are designed to be absorbed in specific aspects of the body. And the reason our digestive system is about, the surface area of 2 tennis courts when you flatten it out is simply because our body has maximized our potential to digest and absorb as much of the nutrition as we possibly can from our food, because the new cells and tissues and whatnot that we make are entirely dependent and made from the very nutrition that we put into our systems. And to be familiar, we have to know these processes so we can understand maybe why a client may have a specific reaction to a certain kind of food. And visual associations are absolutely awesome ways to remember. So anytime you see the word amylase, I hope that everyone goes carbohydrates. Every time you see the word protease, it's an instant recognition for proteins. And lipase is actually for lipids, which we call fats. And understanding where most of these actions take place in relative respect to the nutrient that we're focusing on is a really important thing to understand how to guide your supplemental or dietary strategies based upon what your client may be struggling with. So you have to understand that the process is interrelated with both mechanical and chemical processes in there. So the first one is chewing, mechanical grinding. And the reason we're focusing on chewing is optimal mechanical yields optimal chemical. So once we've actually chewed our food in the mouth and we've mixed our food with salivary amylase, we initiate the carbohydrate digestion process. And then when we swallow our food, it's all chemical from there on in. So chemical breakdown is basically reliant upon the secretions from the major organs. We're talking hydrochloric acid from the stomach, we're talking enzymes from the pancreas, and we're talking bile from the gallbladder in a perfect world. Each organ specifically relates to specialization of large molecule breakdown in the beginning of the digestive process. The small intestine is the site of what I would call small molecule breakdown. We'll get into that talking about products. And this is, post-pancreatic phase when you've released all your enzymes. And the final step of digestion technically takes place at the barrier when it comes to actual absorption of nutrition. But in my opinion, that's not the last aspect of digestion. What goes in must come out. So to really complete and regulate the digestive process, we need to make sure that we're releasing our waste material on a regular basis. So we don't get backlogged, because again, that's another thing that can contribute to downstream consequences when it comes to the health of the microbiome. Knowing the specific nuance of digestion is really important. So understanding that the beginning of the digestive process with carbohydrates is not the beginning of the digestive process with proteins. where the principal site of protein breakdown takes place, which is in the stomach, is not the principal site of fat emulsification. So if you can understand how the different organs, how their different secretions interrelate, and what specific actions take place at that respective site, you'll become a digestive expert and really help to understand why certain food combinations work well with certain kinds of people, why certain digestive enzymes may be optimal for one situation, but may not be as optimal for another. And if you can commit all of these things to memory, I really think you'll get the basics down to the point where you can affect a lot of people just by being what I would call a digestive wizard, because there's a lot of nuance when it comes to digestion. For example, the purpose of an enzyme is to make the body more energetically efficiently able to carry out a biochemical process. So all an enzyme does is it catalyzes a chemical reaction. An enzyme's there, a molecule comes in contact with that enzyme, they bind together, and then that enzyme splits the two products and creates a new molecule. But in the context of digestion, another reason we need to know the nuance is that enzymes are incredibly pH sensitive. So in order to digest protein, we need a very acidic environment. And if you look at the first enzyme in this example, pepsin is the main enzyme that splits large protein molecules in the stomach, and it peaks in its activity at the pH of 2, which is incredibly acidic. In order to properly digest carbohydrates and other aspects of nutrition down the line, we need a pH of 7. So it's important that we know that we can regulate not only our knowledge of what organ does what, but understanding that if we can support and facilitate optimizing the process, then we give the body the best possible chance to optimally break down all the nutrition that it needs, so we don't create the issue of fermenting rather than digesting. So this is why knowing the digestive process helps you target things specifically with our product line. So the quicker word association, which is what I always try to do when it comes to my ability to take a product and explain the benefits to a client or know what to use given a certain situation, is understanding what product lends itself best to what action. Anytime someone's dealing with issues when it comes to being turned off of meat, upper GI bloating, distension of the stomach post-protein intake, I'm thinking HCl. If I know that people have issues with carbohydrate digestion, intolerances of food, or potentially seeing undigested food molecules in their stool, I'm going to bias Digestion or Digestion Plus just because its formula has a full complement of enzymatic support across all pH ranges for optimal breakdown. And if I know someone has a desire for assisting themselves in tolerating a low carbohydrate diet better, I'm going to look at something like Enzymes. And why I would do this is that Enzymes has a couple of unique features that Digestion and Digestion Plus do not. Also, the opposite is true. Enzymes has a very high lipase content. And if you remember that I just mentioned, anytime you think lipase, you think lipids, you think fat digestion. So for those who are wanting to do a low carb, high fat diet, there's an assumption that food eaten is automatically food digested and absorbed. I think everyone here knows that's probably not the case. So Enzymes, with its high lipase content, in addition to the fact that it has the sodium alginate deep delivery technology, is going to really shine in that pH range that is focusing most on when bile mixes with fat and optimizes the ability to support its digestion in the small intestine. HCl is all about increasing the acidity, so decreasing the pH of stomach acid so you can properly denature proteins. And both Digestion and Digestion Plus have an enzyme complement that works across a pH range of about 1 to 12. So what's great about that is fundamentally at some point there's going to be some degree of assistance that someone who may be suffering with digestive dysfunction will receive benefit from. So when you're thinking about digestion, it's not when you start chewing, it's not when you start, tasting the food, it's not even really when you see the food, it's when you smell the food. So the first phase of digestion is really it's called the cephalic phase. And if you think about it for a second, think about as a kid walking into the kitchen, you smell what's being cooked for dinner, it's one of your favorites. Immediately your body knows to get ready for food. It starts to, initiate the release of saliva, you relax a little bit, you recruit your parasympathetic nervous system, and the digestive process initiates when you start to chew your food. And, oftentimes the difference between people who have good digestion and who don't have good digestion is how many times they chew before they swallow and how many years they've been eating like a duck. So chewing is the important process that, you can't supplement, you can't necessarily make a lot of money off of, but as lifestyle advice for your clients, it's essential because the reason we chew is because our stomach doesn't have teeth. You're chewing to liberate not only the enzymes in the live food that you may be eating from storage, but you're also mixing saliva with the food so you can initiate the breakdown of the beginning phase of carbohydrate digestion. And you're also chewing to turn that solid food into something like a paste or a mush so you can maximize the surface area of that food so that food has a better opportunity to mix with the next stuff that the body's going to be making, specifically pepsin and hydrochloric acid. So that's why in the process of digestion, my always step one plan in the process is HCl enzyme. Why? Because if you do not initiate proper digestion in the stomach, and I'll talk about this in a minute, the rest of the digestive process or the digestive cascade becomes compromised. So mechanistically and functionally, HCl enzyme is really about breaking large complex proteins into smaller and smaller peptides. That's the main action because the enzymes that the body makes are meant to act on smaller peptides rather than large protein complexes once they've left the stomach. Hydrochloric acid also does something else for us that's a huge benefit to our overall health, and it's a neutralizer of anything that may come in on the food. Because foodborne pathogens, i.e. food poisoning, and anyone who's ever experienced it knows exactly what I'm talking about, is one of the worst experiences you can ever have. Clutching the bathroom, promising God you'll never eat another bad food if he just makes this go away at 2 a.m. So if our hydrochloric acid acidity is not on point, our ability to neutralize any potential pathogens, be it bacteria, fungus that may be present on the food, might not work properly, and that has therefore now gotten into our system and will piss off our immune system. The reason stomach digestion is so essential is you have this process called the acid trigger. So if you're going to digest protein and you want your pH levels to drop down below a pH of 3, that is the needed range to stimulate the next process of digestion. So if we want to make sure that we're ensuring the process of digestion is going to be smooth and efficient, it really does start with protein digestion. A lot of people who struggle with stress, anxiety, essentially the symptoms of sympathetic dominance of the nervous system, will have a hard time initiating protein digestion because of hypochlorhydria, their inability to release enough stomach acid. And protein is one of those things that if you don't digest it properly, it can really become quite nasty in your system. If anyone's ever left a protein shaker cup in their car for a couple months and they open it, they'll know it is probably one of the most rancid smells known to man. And if you're not digesting your proteins and you're not able to properly break them down and absorb them in the small intestine, excessive amounts of protein and amino acid getting to the colon is going to create a lot of downstream problems, especially things like the creation of excessive hydrogen sulfide. So that's the initial phase of digestion. Protein digestion, HCl. Why? Because we want to stimulate the acid trigger to generate the necessary steps in the process to get to what I call as step 2 in the support plan. This is where the enzymes come in. So when food leaves the stomach, it's technically called chyme, and it's incredibly acidic. Let's say it has a pH of about 3. In the previous graphic that showed the pH ranges of enzyme function, we want the activity in the small intestine to be optimally somewhere between 6 and 7, which is fairly neutral. So as long as the food leaving the stomach is acidic, that is the appropriate trigger for the pancreas to release a few things. Number 1, the pancreas releases enzymes in both the context of proteins and carbs and fats, but it also releases something called sodium bicarbonate. And what sodium bicarbonate does is it elevates the pH, it neutralizes the acidity so it doesn't cause damage to the fragile tissues inside of our gut. This is where the medium-sized food molecules that have been initially broken down through chewing and through stomach function enter our small intestine, and this is where the vast majority of digestion really happens. So the pancreas releases enzymes, as I mentioned, it releases the bicarbonate, and the third amigo in the process is the gallbladder, which concentrates bile and releases bile at this point all into the common bile duct to emulsify the fat, so the enzymes in the pancreas are able to act upon those fat droplets so they can start to break them down to reabsorb them. So you see right there, the pH range, food leaves the stomach at 1.5 to 3, It quickly enters the initial part of the small intestine at 6. It goes all the way up to 7.5, and then it drops back down to 5.7 before it hits the colon. That's a massive range because a pH from 6 to 7 is a lot bigger than it sounds in terms of its differentiation. And in order to make sure that this is optimized, the process needs to be strong in terms of each organ and its ability to contribute to show up to work. So we know that stomach is denaturation of protein. The pancreatic contributions are pancreatic amylase are breaking down medium-sized carbohydrate molecules to smaller carb molecules. Pancreatic lipase is forcing the body to be able to break down triglycerides to free fatty acids. And at this point, the pancreatic protease digestion is taking these medium-sized peptides and breaking them into smaller and smaller little protein chains. And the last stage in the small intestine, and this is as it goes through the entire tube, is what happens at the epithelial barrier. Most people think the epithelial barrier is purely absorption, which that is its main job, but you have brush border enzymes. And what brush border enzymes do is it's the last step of digestion before the absorption process. So they don't have a very big bandwidth of what they're capable of doing. If you think about something, you take a pair of scissors and you cut something in half, that's likely the affinity of what the brush border enzymes do. It's the final step of digestion. So what you're doing is you're taking carbohydrates and making them mono and polysaccharides. You're taking proteins and making them amino acids and peptides. And free fatty acids are being reassembled into triglycerides. And these three additional considerations are very important when it comes to understanding the nature of enzymes. A body that is not healthy won't have enough body temperature to actively create an environment where enzymes are functioning optimally. pH range is very important, which is why US Enzymes uses plant-based enzymes, because as strong as pancreatic enzymes can be, their pH window is a lot narrower. So if you have a pH range that's going to swing from 3 to 9 within the body, if you have a plant enzyme formula that operates from a pH range of 1 to 12, you've covered all your bases. And the last thing is making sure that your client is hydrated and there's enough water coming into the system, because not only do you need water to catalyze biochemical reactions, for food to move through the system, if the body's dehydrated, the inability for the migrating motor complex and peristalsis to regulate that food going through the small intestine and ultimately leaving the body may lead to constipation. So looking at the medium phase of digestive enzyme function, pancreatic and gallbladder function are absolutely essential. And if the body is deficient in energy and energetic output, that may compromise how much enzymatic activity and bile that the liver and the gallbladder can make. But additionally, people who have digestive congestion, they have gallbladder dysfunction, they have somewhat of a compromised liver function, we want to make sure that we can help support these people to continue to digest and break down food while whatever is afflicting them is being figured out by their practitioner and ultimately, hopefully, being remedied, so they may not need to use a digestive enzyme moving forwards. Looking at the back of a label can be quite confusing because you see all these different functional units and HUTs and CUs. These are different designations that not only describe the quantity of each enzyme, but the potency and the activity. The important thing here is to note with Digestion and Digestion Plus, as I said, it has an incredibly amazing ability to support protein and carbohydrate digestion, but it also helps those who may be a little more intolerant of certain kinds of fibers, because the human body does not make an enzyme that splits beta bonds in the carbohydrates that we call fiber. But using a digestive enzyme for someone who may be tolerant to FODMAPs or highly fermentable carbohydrates in different foods may allow them to enjoy more of the foods you as a practitioner may want them to eat that they can't tolerate because their microbiome and their immune system is a little bit too angry and activated. Contrasting that with ensalase, you can see here that the lipase quantity is really the focus of this, but in addition to that, you have the oleic acid and the sunflower lecithin, i.e. the enzystim, because one of the things that this product was always known for was being a probiotic compatible enzyme, because probiotics do need some food as they're getting delivered into the small and large intestine. But the sodium alginate is really good because it targets the specific area of anatomy in the small intestine that really does help what I call the compromised gallbladder crowd, to where they may not be able to make enough bile, or they may need to make more lipase to make up for the fact that their bile secretion is a little bit compromised. And this is the product that I would use if someone is wanting to try a low carb, carnivore, keto style diet, if it's a lot higher in fats and they're greatly reducing carbohydrate intake. And this has taken us all the way to the end, the brush border, and this is essentially where the final magic happens. And this is where the story starts to connect to next month's, because this is the critical juncture point. If you look at mechanistically how our epithelial cells are designed to absorb things, they create very small enzymes, which are very specifically targeted to the macronutrient that they are designed to break down. So a sucrase or a maltase, that's a carbohydrate enzyme. If there's not the ability to break those carbohydrates down properly along the way, then this absorption process isn't going to go all that well. And besides creating digestive dysfunction, the other consequence of not breaking down our food are broad spectrum nutritional deficiencies. We don't realize that, or maybe we do, but we should probably revisit the idea that in order to absorb a vitamin, it needs to be chelated to a nutrient, specifically amino acid, for example. Same thing with a mineral. Macronutrient digestion and its ability to be completed is essential for micronutrient absorption, because we don't digest micronutrients, we absorb them. And the way they go through the body is through the paracellular process, i.e. through the cell, rather than go through the little gap that forms when the body becomes chronically compromised and inflamed and develops this process called leaky gut, which likely everyone on the planet has. So the essential nature for optimal digestion, just to review, we want to completely denature proteins. We want to break them into amino acids. That's a job of the protease enzyme. We want to completely cleave polysaccharides, so cut up large complex carbohydrate molecules into simple monosaccharides, simple sugars. Fats are a little bit more confusing, but fundamentally we're taking and breaking down triglycerides into free fatty acids. And if everyone remembers from biochemical class, they fundamentally get reconstructed into triglycerides, and they don't actually get absorbed into the bloodstream. They get absorbed into the lymphatic system, and they go around lymphatic circulation before they get ducted into the circulatory system where all the other nutrients go. So the result outcome is adequate digestion yields adequate absorption. This makes perfect sense. As a result of that, we have minimal nutritional inadequacies or lack of functional deficiencies. If we properly digest our food, we don't have post-consumption modification of the microbiome. And what I mean by that is food not completely digested in the small intestine will enter the colon, and our enzymes, if they're not able to properly break that food down to absorb it, the enzymes that the microbes in our microbiome contain in the colon do have the ability to break these bonds, and they can ferment sugars and they can ferment proteins. So if that does happen, we have an increased likelihood of developing food sensitivities or food sensitization. And as a result of that, we typically see that people have this chronic recruitment of the immune system, i.e. an inflammatory response, and the development of food sensitivities, i.e. or food allergies. And fundamentally, the regulation of peristalsis becomes compromised because we're not able to move food through our systems at a regular speed, and we either default to chronic constipation or chronic loose stool. And this is the consequences of poor digestion if we take it a little bit further. So within the context of the microbiome, if we compromise the ecosystem in our microbiome, a few things start to happen. First and foremost, it is the microbiome and the immune system that are always talking to each other to make sure things are all hospitable, but they shouldn't be interacting too closely. If we create a dysbiotic scenario in the gut, what typically happens is we start to create increased levels of inflammation, we thin our mucosal barrier, and then all of a sudden, the bacteria in our colon and the immune cells are too closely interacting, and that causes disharmony. When that happens, the immune system not only has to get involved because it's the ultimate mediator, but we start to increase the bombardment of our immune system with things that it's not meant to see. We're seeing incompletely digested protein molecules get into the bloodstream, excessive amounts of undigested food molecules are getting into the colon, and then as a result of that, we have this local response of inflammation that can become a systemic response, i.e. when things get past the gut barrier, and all of a sudden, the analogy that I like to use is you have your sewer system emptying contents into the waterway coming into your house. So here we experience the concept of metabolic endotoxemia. We experience chronic immune activation, which can lead to chronic immune stress. We increase our burden of detoxification. If a certain organ that is trying to regulate immune function, like the thymus or the spleen, gets compromised, we see organ dysfunction, so on and so forth. And this is why I introduced this talk, talking about the interconnected nature of the body being this one ecosystem that has to have the ability to recognize and regulate itself. Because when it loses that ability, that syntropy, that organizational structure descends into chaos. And how we experience chaos is not the knowledge of chaos being felt, it's through the consequences of symptom activation and immune activation and feeling crappy and having low energy and descending into illness. So we have to figure out, starting with digestion, how can we support our people in what they're experiencing so we can help reverse engineer the process of the body healing itself? I believe that's truly what happens. The supplements are catalysts to provide the right signal for the body to be able to regain its health via improved vitality, the restoration of dysfunction, and ultimately the ability to heal broken tissue. So when you want to start picking a product, well, how do you go about doing so? First and foremost, knowing the digestive process allows you to figure out what aspect of the digestive process may be most problematic or symptomatic. From there, what I suggest doing is matching a product via knowing how that product works to the symptom that the client is presenting. And then you got to test it out and hopefully assess that your call was right. So to all the clinicians here, do you know what signs of protein digestion issues are? Do you know what the consequences of dysfunction in the upper GI system is? Is heartburn really an over acidity problem, or is it an under acidity problem because the pyloric sphincter isn't closing because the stomach isn't making enough hydrochloric acid? Is abdominal distension in SIBO, is it a sign of carbohydrate intolerance or something bigger? Is the inability to digest fat and have something run through you like a Japanese bullet train because you don't have a gallbladder something that needs intervention? I mean, absolutely. But the more you can take these conceptual frameworks of what we've spoken about today, understand where in the digestive system something takes place, understand the mechanism of action, and how each individual product and its formulation is targeted to support a different element of what someone may be experiencing, all you have to do is learn to read the signs of what the client's presenting to you. And if you do some more deep functional medicine testing, understand what biomarkers correlate well with specific things. Case in point, anytime I run a stool test, I'm always looking at, pancreatic exocrine function on a GI stool test. Why? Because I want to see if they're making enzymes. Then I'll look at the products of protein and fat breakdown just to see if they're actually breaking down the food before it actually enters the colon. These are important things to really understand. And when it comes to knowing how much to take and what to take, each client is a little bit different. So what I created was maximum and minimum concepts. And these can be varied depending upon who you're talking about and how they develop, because as an individual gets better, their health and their overall energy might necessitate you pulling back on support. For example, when someone's really compromised, I think they should be taking HCl with major meals. But if you heal their digestive function and you re-entrain their autonomic nervous system, maybe they take an HCl only when they go out for a big steak, something of that nature. Same thing with a digestive enzyme. If you're going to digest something that your body is knowingly not going to like, it's the same reason you buy insurance when you rent a car. You can jump it and they'll cover the costs. So take a digestive enzyme as an insurance policy if you have strong digestion, or if you're someone who has an incredible amount of food sensitivities, take one at every meal just to ensure that you're maximizing your digestive potential. Again, there's no hard and fast rule, and you can mix these products in combination. I've seen great success pairing HCl with Digestine Plus at every meal for a few months for people who have had very compromised digestion. I myself have all of these products in my cabinet, but I don't take them every day. I take them when I feel I may need them, or when I want to eat something that may not be the best for me, or I may not digest well. But it's knowing how to use the tool that really makes the tool useful. It's not the tool in existence simply in and of itself. The last thing I do want to touch on is something called glutathione. which has a little bit of a dual purpose, and I'm going to focus on the digestion aspect of it today. So glutathione is basically an incredibly high concentration of DPP4 enzyme plus some additional support enzymes to break down what I would call trace residues of gluten. So if someone's hoping that they can go order a pizza and this will make their ability to digest pizza being gluten sensitive, no problem. Sorry to inform you that's not gonna happen. Being said, if you're gonna have pizza, wouldn't hurt to take 2 or 3 of these. This is for those who may not have celiac, or if they do have celiac and they're worried about trace residues of gluten cross-contamination in outside food settings. What I mean by that is if someone is eating a food that's labeled gluten-free, there is a chance it may not be truly gluten-free if it's in a commercial kitchen. If someone is gluten intolerant and gluten sensitive and they want to go out for sushi and they don't realize that sushi in a restaurant is not, soy sauce in a restaurant is not made from soybeans, but rather mulled wheat. And they don't tolerate that really well, but the sushi says gluten-free because it's only rice and fish. This is where something like glutathione can come in. You can, in fact, mix glutathione with any other digestive enzyme. It just creates a broader scope of enzymes within your supplemental regime. So this is the single most satisfying slide to me because once you can see the interconnectedness of how this is designed, whoever designed this has an absolute genius for systems thinking, but it shows you how, even though this process is quite complex, it is not a super complex process. If you understand the major nodes in the network, the major cogs in the wheel, and you commit this process to memory, then you can understand why when someone mixes fruit and protein and they get bloating and abdominal distension, why those two things didn't digest well, because proteins and sugars digest at very different speeds, for example. So I would encourage you all to commit this to some degree of memory so you can have that word association. And when you're educating your clients about food combinations or picking supplemental strategies to help them with their digestion, it's going to be so impactful because no matter what someone's suffering with, in my opinion, if you improve digestive function, you will help that person to some degree get better. And if you get really lucky, someone's symptoms are simply digestive dysfunction that has gone awry. If you get that back in balance, the body can bring itself back into an optimal state. So that was a lot of information I threw at everyone. I thank you for your indulging and diving into the digestive process. Next month, we're going to go to phase 2, which is basically understanding that we've covered digestion and the inclusion of human diet and how that, in addition to other variables, can impact the microbiome and how the development of a pathogenic profile in your gut microbiota will predispose you to the latter half of that story, that leaky gut, that thin mucosa, that hypervigilant immune system, and the downstream consequences of when that barrier to the inside of your body gets breached and compromised. And in my opinion, the disease manifestation is the ultimate last attempt at the body to try to get itself back into balance because it sequesters off the issue in a specific area rather than making it a true systemic problem. So with that, if there's any questions, I will stop the screen share and I'll hand it back to you, Jeff.